In the quiet town of Gray, nestled within the picturesque French countryside, life moved at an unhurried pace, where days unfolded predictably, and nothing ever seemed out of place. Yet, on one crisp October morning, the town's serenity would be shattered by an unimaginable darkness. "I'll be back soon." Those were the last words Alexia Duvall uttered as she laced up her running shoes and stepped out for her routine morning jog. At just 29 years old, Alexia was the picture of vitality. A woman whose bright smile could illuminate even the gloomiest day. But what began as an ordinary Saturday turned into a haunting mystery. Hours passed, and her silence grew louder, a deafening void that filled the hearts of those who loved her with dread. 2 days later, that dreadful silence was replaced by the horrifying truth. Hidden within a forest clearing, Alexia's body was found, burned and abandoned beneath a pile of branches. Her lifeless form told a story of violence and betrayal, one she could never voice herself. The nation was gripped by the tragedy, and as investigators scoured every lead, theories swirled. Was it the work of a predator lurking in the shadows? A random act of violence in a town where such evil was unheard of? Yet, the most shocking twist was not buried in the woods but stood in plain sight. Jonathan Duvall, Alexia's husband. Jonathan was the epitome of grief, a heartbroken widower whose tears flowed freely at vigils and press conferences. He clung to Alexia's parents for solace, his sobs filling the silence of their shared loss. On live television, he painted a portrait of undying love, a husband torn apart by an unspeakable loss. But behind the public display, the cracks in his story began to widen. Inconsistencies in his accounts sparked whispers of suspicion, and those whispers soon unraveled a web of lies. This wasn't just a crime. It was a betrayal that shattered not only trust but the very foundation of love and innocence. Alexia Fouliot Duvall was born on February 18, 1988, in Gray, France. The young girl was known for her kindness and sharp wit. Her magnetic smile and warm demeanor earned her the admiration of all who crossed her path. A bank employee by profession, she balanced her sharp intellect with a love for life's simple pleasures. Sunday brunches with her parents, quiet evenings with her cat, and morning jogs through the forest trails she adored. Her marriage to Jonathan Duvall seemed to complete the picture-perfect image of her life. The two met in their early 20s and quickly became inseparable. Jonathan, a reserved IT technician, often spoke of Alexia as the missing piece of his life. Together, they appeared to share a bond envied by many. Training for marathons, hosting cozy dinner parties, and dreaming of the family they would one day build. But idyllic facades are often deceiving. Friends occasionally noticed moments of strain in Alexia's smile or the way she deflected questions about her marriage. These fleeting signs, insignificant at the time, would later gain a chilling significance. On October 28, 2017, Alexia set out for her usual morning jog through the familiar wooded trails of Gray. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of damp leaves and pine as she disappeared into the forest. Hours passed, and when she didn't return, Jonathan's concern began to grow. He called her phone repeatedly, each unanswered ring tightening the knot of fear in his chest. Unable to shake his unease, Jonathan retraced her jogging route, scanning the wooded paths she frequented. By mid-afternoon, he reached out to Alexia's parents, his voice trembling as he confessed that she was missing. Her family sprang into action, retracing her steps and questioning anyone who might have seen her that morning. The growing unease soon turned to panic. Isabelle, Alexia's mother, paced the streets while her father, Jean-Pierre, stopped passers-by, hoping for a glimpse of his daughter. Each shake of the head or blank stare only deepened their dread. As night fell, Jonathan walked into the local gendarmerie, pale and shaken, to file a missing persons report. "She never just disappears," he murmured, his voice heavy with worry. The report sent shockwaves through Gray, a town where reliability and routine were a way of life. A woman like Alexia, a beloved daughter, friend, and wife, couldn't simply vanish without a trace. The following day, the search intensified. Over 250 volunteers joined the police, scouring the forested trails and surrounding fields. Search dogs sniffed for clues, drones hovered overhead, and Alexia's smiling face was broadcast on every local station, accompanied by desperate pleas for her safe return. Near a secluded jogging trail, the first clue emerged. A water bottle abandoned in the dirt. The discovery jolted the searchers, a grim confirmation that Alexia had been there. But the stillness of the surrounding woods was suffocating, as if the trees themselves held their breath. Then, on October 30th, the search ended in devastation. A group of volunteers stumbled upon a horrifying sight deep within the forest. Beneath a pile of branches, partially burned, lay Alexia's lifeless body. The air seemed to freeze as the realization of what they had found took hold. The clothing matched Alexia's description, erasing any remaining hope of a different outcome. Gray, a town where nothing bad was supposed to happen, was thrust into the national spotlight. Vigil after vigil filled the town square, candles illuminating tear-streaked faces. Alexia's parents clung to each other, their grief palpable as strangers and neighbors alike embraced them. The tragedy of Alexia's death transcended Gray, capturing the attention of an entire nation. As the investigation unfolded, the comforting notion of a random predator lurking in the shadows began to unravel. Whispers spread. A far more sinister truth might lie far closer to home. Jonathan Duvall, once the picture of a grieving husband, was about to become the focus of a nation's suspicion. On October 30th, 2017, just hours after the discovery of Alexia's charred remains in the forest, Jonathan stood in the heart of Greystown Square at a candlelight vigil. His face was an anguished mask, streaked with tears that glistened in the pale light of the candles. His hands clutched desperately at Alexia's parents, Isabelle and Jean-Pierre, seeking solace in their embrace. To the watching world, he was the epitome of grief. A husband undone by the brutality of his wife's violent death. "She was everything to me," he whispered to the cameras, his voice trembling with the weight of sorrow. His pain seemed real, raw, and undeniable. To the world, Jonathan was a man shattered by loss, a tragic figure whose wife had been stolen from him in an unfathomable act of cruelty. As he gave interviews in the days that followed, his voice soft, his eyes filled with sorrow, the narrative began to take shape. He spoke of Alexia, their shared dreams, the life they had planned together. A future that had now been cruelly torn from his grasp. National news outlets portrayed him as a man in mourning, his heart laid bare for all to see. The public's sympathy poured out in waves, supporting him as the devastated husband left behind in a cruel twist of fate. Investigators, too, initially bought into the story. They theorized it could have been a random attack. A senseless act of violence against a woman simply out for a morning jog. The quiet seclusion of Alexia's route, bordered by dense forest, suggested that a stranger might have targeted her. Whispers of a passing drifter, or perhaps a repeat offender, began to circulate, but the brutality of the crime painted a darker picture. A rage so fierce that it seemed almost personal. Yet, as the investigation unfolded, small cracks began to appear in Jonathan's perfect portrayal of the grieving husband. In November 2017, the police made a chilling revelation. Alexia had been strangled before her body was set ablaze. The news sent shockwaves through the case, for strangulation is a violent, intimate act. One often committed by someone close to the victim. With this new information, investigators turned their attention toward Jonathan. His alibi, that he had been home alone while Alexia went for her jog, began to unravel. Neighbors reported seeing his car on the move that morning, and surveillance footage captured his vehicle near the forested area where Alexia's body had been found. What had once seemed like a tragic, senseless crime now appeared to be something much darker. By mid-November, the investigation began to focus on Jonathan. His behavior, too, had started to raise suspicions. While Alexia's family spoke with clarity, their words raw with genuine grief, Jonathan's responses seemed oddly rehearsed. His outward devastation sometimes gave way to moments that felt forced, as if he were trying too hard to convince the world of his sorrow. Then, on November 20th, came a breakthrough. Police discovered burned items near the crime scene. Fragments of clothing that, shockingly, matched Jonathan's DNA. Behind closed doors, investigators were quietly rethinking their theories. Though they publicly maintained a broad focus, their gaze had increasingly turned toward Jonathan. Weeks passed, but Jonathan continued to play the part of the mourning husband. On November 30th, he stood once more beside Alexia's parents at another public vigil, his trembling hands and tear-streaked face captured by the cameras. Yet those who watched him closely couldn't shake the sense that he was performing, sticking to a script of grief that never seemed to waver. It was a masterful act, but little did Jonathan know, the investigators were watching him closely too. They had begun to see through his facade. By January 2018, the investigation reached a boiling point. The initial theory of a random attack had all but disintegrated, replaced by mounting evidence that pointed closer to home. Jonathan Duvall, once the face of sorrow, was now the prime suspect. The cracks in his story had expanded, and the mounting evidence made it clear. The man who had played the grieving husband so convincingly was hiding something far darker. In his car's trunk, traces of Alexia's blood were found. Proof that his claim of being home alone was a lie. Surveillance footage, DNA, and forensic evidence all connected him to the crime. Desperate to maintain his innocence, Jonathan was questioned again and again, but his defenses began to crumble. When pressed about the footage showing his car near the forest, his response was hesitant and disjointed. The moment of truth came when a detective leaned in, his voice cutting through the silence. "We know you were there, Jonathan. Tell us the truth." For a long moment, the room was thick with tension. Jonathan's shoulders sagged under the weight of the lie that had held him up for so long. And then he spoke. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper, the words tumbling out as if he couldn't hold them in any longer. In the hours that followed, Jonathan unraveled the terrifying truth. He confessed to killing Alexia in a violent, heated argument. She had confronted him about feeling neglected in their relationship, and the fight escalated into rage. "I didn't mean to," he repeated, his voice breaking, but it was clear that in his fury, he had crossed a point of no return. After strangling her, Jonathan drove Alexia's lifeless body to the forest, where he set her body on fire, attempting to destroy any evidence of his crime. The confession sent shockwaves through the nation. The public, who had once mourned alongside Jonathan, now felt a deep sense of betrayal. Social media exploded with outrage. How could the man who had cried so openly at vigils, who had stood with Alexia's parents, now be revealed as her killer? Isabel and Jean-Pierre, who had welcomed Jonathan into their grief, were left to face a horrifying reality, one they could never have imagined. Their son-in-law had murdered their daughter. The grief, already unbearable, was now compounded by an unspeakable betrayal. Jonathan's confession marked a pivotal moment, but it left more questions than answers. Why had he gone to such lengths to fabricate his innocence? What had driven him to such violent extremes? How could the man who had appeared so ordinary harbor such a dark secret? In Gray, where life had always seemed safe and predictable, the truth shattered their sense of security. Neighbors, once supportive, now whispered about Jonathan's cold, calculated actions. His betrayal had left a deep scar on the community. The confession also ignited a broader conversation about domestic violence, about control, manipulation, and the hidden cracks in relationships that can spiral into violence. Alexia's tragic death was a reminder that the greatest danger can sometimes come from those closest to us. As Jonathan was formally charged with Alexia's murder, his public mask of grief had been completely torn away. The tearful interviews, once seen as a man's desperate cry for justice, now appeared as nothing more than a cold performance. But the truth was out. Jonathan's confession was just the beginning of the long, painful journey toward justice. A trial loomed on the horizon, where every horrific detail of his crime would be laid bare for all to see. For Alexia's family, for the people of Gray, and for the millions who had once believed in Jonathan's sorrow, the healing process had only just begun. The lies, the betrayal, and the chilling nature of the crime would linger long after the case was closed. On November 16, 2020, the courthouse in Versailles was buzzing with anticipation as the trial that had captivated France began. It wasn't just another case. It was the one that shook a nation to its core. The people gathered outside, eager to catch a glimpse of the man who had turned from a grieving husband to the villain of the story. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The ghost of Alexia Duval's tragic death hung over every whispered conversation. Jonathan Duval, once the face of a mourning spouse, now walked into the courtroom, his features gaunt, his face pale. His transformation was unmistakable. Gone was the man who had wept at vigils, his cries echoing in the dark corners of a city that had witnessed his grief. Now, dressed in a dark suit, he sat in silence, his eyes fixed downward. Across the room, Alexia's parents, Isabelle and Jean-Pierre Fouliat, sat together, their grief raw, their eyes pools of sorrow. They clung to each other, not just for comfort, but for strength. Their pain was palpable, but there was a fire in them, an unshakable resolve to see justice done. The trial began with the prosecution setting the stage for what was to be a gut-wrenching series of revelations. They meticulously outlined the brutal sequence of events, detailing how Jonathan had strangled Alexia in the heat of a violent argument, then callously discarded her body in a forest, trying to destroy the evidence in a desperate attempt to cover his tracks. The crime scene photos, stark and haunting, were projected on the courtroom walls. A collective gasp rippled through the room as the magnitude of the cruelty sank in. Then, it was the family's turn to take the stand. Isabelle's voice trembled as she spoke, but her words rang out with painful clarity. "Alexia was the light of our lives," she said, her voice breaking with every syllable. She spoke of Alexia's kindness, her dreams of motherhood, and the joy she brought to everyone who knew her. Jean-Pierre, his face flushed with emotion, turned his gaze towards Jonathan. "You were like a son to us," he said, his voice cracking. "How could you take her from us?" The courtroom held its breath as the weight of his words settled over the room. As the defense presented its case, the contrast was striking. Jonathan's lawyers painted him as a broken man, pushed to the brink. They argued that the murder was not premeditated, but the result of a heated argument gone terribly wrong. They described him as emotionally fragile, manipulated by Alexia's frustrations with their marriage. Jonathan himself took the stand on the third day, his voice barely audible as he explained his actions. "I never meant to hurt her," he whispered, his words soaked in regret. "I loved her." But the prosecution was unyielding. They dismantled Jonathan's fragile defense, pointing out the chilling actions he took after the murder. The burning of Alexia's body, they argued, was not a mistake. It was a calculated effort to erase the evidence. They painted Jonathan not as a broken man, but as a manipulator who had deceived everyone around him. This was not a lapse in judgment, the prosecutor declared. It was an act of control, an act of brutality. The trial quickly became a media spectacle. Every twist and turn was dissected by French news outlets. Opinions were divided across the nation. Some saw Jonathan as a man broken by his own actions, a victim of his emotions. Others saw him as a cold-hearted killer who had betrayed not just his wife, but an entire nation. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered every day, holding signs that read "Justice for Alexia." On social media, hashtags like "Justice for Alexia" trended, as people across France expressed their outrage, their grief, and their disbelief. As the trial neared its conclusion, the prosecution delivered their closing argument, describing Alexia's final moments. The fear, the sense of betrayal, and the heartbreak she must have felt in the face of the man she had once loved. They urged the jury to see through Jonathan's feigned fragility and recognize the calculated cruelty of his actions. On November 20th, 2020, after 5 days of intense testimony, the jury reached its verdict. Jonathan Duval was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. The room was silent as the judge read the verdict, the weight of justice hanging heavily in the air. For Alexia's parents, it was a bittersweet moment. They held each other tightly, tears streaming down their faces, as a small measure of closure settled over them. Outside, the crowd erupted in applause and tears, their collective voice a powerful echo of justice being served, but also of a life that could never be returned. The trial had come to an end, but its impact was far from over. This was more than a courtroom drama. It was a wake-up call for the entire country. It exposed the darkness that can hide behind closed doors, the secrets that lurk in seemingly perfect relationships. It forced the nation to confront the reality of domestic violence and the devastating consequences of unchecked control and abuse. For Alexia's family, the verdict was not the end. It was a beginning. They channeled their grief into action, launching campaigns to raise awareness about domestic violence. They spoke at rallies, sharing Alexia's story, urging others to recognize the warning signs of abuse before it's too late. Alexia's voice was taken from her, Isabel declared at one rally. But through us, she'll keep speaking. Alexia's story became a rallying cry for change. It sparked national conversations about trust, control, and the hidden dangers within relationships. Her legacy continues to grow, her name remembered not just as a victim, but as a beacon for change. Her tragic death was the catalyst for a movement. One that continues to fight for the safety of those who feel trapped in the shadows of abuse. The case of Jonathan Duvall may have closed, but Alexia's story has left an indelible mark on the hearts of those who knew her, and on a nation that will never forget. In the tight-knit town of Hemphill, Texas, where everyone knew each other and nothing seemed capable of shattering the peaceful facade, Halloween 2020 brought a horror that no one could have anticipated. The small community was rocked to its core when 19-year-old Livy Lewis, a bright nursing assistant with a promising future, was found dead in her car, a rifle shot to her neck. Her tragic and senseless death would set off an investigation that would unearth a tangled web of jealousy, betrayal, and love gone horribly wrong. As law enforcement delved deeper into the circumstances surrounding Livy's final hours, they uncovered a devastating story of emotional abuse, secret relationships, and a love triangle that ultimately led to her untimely demise. What began as a mystery quickly evolved into a quest for justice, leaving the people of Hemphill questioning how something so horrific could happen in their quiet, unsuspecting town. Livy Lewis was born on October 4, 2001, in Shreveport, Louisiana. Livy had just turned 19 and had so much of her life ahead of her. She was loved by everyone who knew her. A straight-A student, a dedicated nursing assistant, and someone who genuinely cared for others, she was described as selfless and kind-hearted. Those who knew her best, like her best friend Taylor Barnett, a fellow nursing assistant, would attest to her gentle nature and her love for her work in the nursing home where she was already making a difference in the lives of the elderly residents. But beneath the surface of Livy's promising future, a tumultuous relationship with an older man, Matthew Edgar, would spiral out of control. At 23, Matthew was married to Montana Bacall and had 2 young sons, but he quickly became entangled in a secret relationship with Livy, one that would ultimately cost her her life. Despite the affair's brief duration, Matthew would not let go of Livy, and the emotional turmoil between the three would only intensify. The night before her death, Livy had broken up with Matthew, fed up with his controlling and abusive behavior. But as was often the case in Hemphill, a small town with limited escape, Livy couldn't entirely escape the ties that bound her to him. In the early morning hours of October 31st, Matthew and Livy found themselves face to face once again. But this time, it would be the last time. Livy's mother, Darcy Bass, was woken up with the news no parent ever wants to hear. Her daughter was dead. Her life was taken so suddenly, so violently, that it left her in a state of disbelief. "I didn't know if she was dead or alive," Darcy recalled. "The next time I saw her, she was in a casket." As authorities worked to unravel the mystery of Livy's death, the investigation pointed to Matthew, who had been found in a fetal position behind Livy's car. Covered in blood, he claimed to have no memory of what happened, but his story was full of holes. The investigation revealed that Matthew had been drinking heavily the night before and had been in the company of Livy up until the early hours of the morning. What happened next was unclear, but evidence soon pointed to a chilling truth. Matthew Edgar was involved in Livy's murder. Despite Matthew's attempts to cover up the truth, the evidence was overwhelming. Blood samples, DNA testing, and the discovery of a rifle at the scene all pointed to his involvement in Livy's tragic death. Yet, in his initial interviews with authorities, Matthew showed no remorse and no real emotion at all. He offered no explanation for his actions, and despite being arrested, he remained eerily indifferent. As the investigation continued, more details of Matthew and Livy's toxic relationship surfaced. Text messages revealed abuse, manipulation, and cheating. Details that painted a grim picture of their time together. But the most heartbreaking part of the story was the realization that Livy, despite everything, had been in love with the man who ultimately took her life. Matthew Edgar was charged with homicide, and as the case moved to the grand jury, the people of Hemphill waited for justice. Livy's death was not just a tragic loss for her family but for a small town that had lost one of its brightest stars. As the story of Livy Lewis unfolded, it became clear that the line between love and hate, affection and manipulation, could be tragically thin. As the investigation deepened, Sheriff McDonough enlisted the help of the Texas Rangers to unravel the haunting mystery surrounding Livy's tragic death. Matthew Edgar seemed like an easy arrest, but the situation was far from simple. One key figure in Matthew's life was Sean Dunn, an old friend from his past. The two had a history together, and in their conversations, Matthew tried to defend himself. "Look, I didn't do this," Matthew insisted, his voice filled with desperation. "Yes, I was there at the scene, but I swear I didn't do it. I loved her." Sean, a former oil and gas man turned deputy sheriff, had spent years working with Matthew. He remembered the young man as a hard worker, someone who valued family and friendships. "I know Matthew," Sean reflected. "We spent a lot of time together. He loved his family, he valued his friendships. He was a good person." With years of law enforcement experience under his belt, Sean understood what it took to identify a killer. "When you sit across from someone who's taken a life, you can feel it," he said, his voice carrying a solemn weight. "But Matthew, I never saw that in him. I've never seen him reach that point." In Sean's eyes, Matthew was telling the truth when he said he had no memory of what happened that night. But the cause of Livy's death was undeniable. It was violent, unnatural. Yet, a haunting question lingered: if Matthew Edgar didn't kill Livy, then who did? This was the crucial question that still hung in the air, unanswered. Sean had his suspicions, but he refused to name names. Both Matthew and his mother, Cindy, had hinted that someone else could be responsible for Livy's death. The name Montana was mentioned more than once, and the tapes from jailhouse calls between Matthew and his mother raised even more questions. In one chilling moment, Matthew asked his mother, "If it turns out Montana did this, do you want to talk about it?" His voice was thick with a mix of disbelief and raw emotion. "But you're not going to want to hurt her, are you? She killed the woman you loved, after all." Sheriff McDonough couldn't ignore Montana's strange relationship with Livy. The two women had an undeniably complicated connection. Montana was the woman who, despite having left her husband for another woman, called Livy her best friend. "I have to question that as an investigator," McDonough mused. "A woman says, 'My husband left me for this woman, but she's my best friend.' That raises red flags." One of the last photos of Livy captured a smiling, carefree moment with Montana, taken at a party where Matthew had been a silent observer. According to Bobby Ozan, who hosted the party, Matthew spent the night watching as Livy and Montana interacted with everyone but him. He felt excluded, ignored. Matthew tried to approach them, but they wouldn't engage. The more he drank, the more isolated and angry he became. Bobby observed Matthew growing increasingly irritable, drinking beer, but nothing seemed to calm the storm brewing inside him. He was just on edge, Bobby recalled. He wasn't himself. The more he drank, the angrier he got. As the night wore on, Matthew's simmering frustration finally boiled over. After calling it a night and heading home, his memory goes blank. But Montana's recollection was far clearer. In a recorded interview, She recalled how Matthew had stormed back to the party when he found out that Livy had decided to stay the night at Bobby's place. "I know he heard her say it," Montana explained, her voice tinged with unease. "And that made him so mad. It was as if everything snapped." It was during this volatile moment that Matthew's dark jealousy fully erupted. "I was going to ask Livy to marry me," he confessed to investigators. "That's how much I loved her." Montana described how Matthew turned his anger toward her. "He tried to choke me," she said. "So I ran to get Bobby." The violence didn't stop there. Matthew was so consumed by rage that he even vandalized the car, kicking in doors and punching windows. Montana feared for her life, but Bobby intervened, pinning Matthew against the car so she could escape. Montana fled with Livy, each in separate cars, desperate for safety. But Matthew wasn't done. He tracked them down, chasing Montana until he cornered her. In the heat of the confrontation, Matthew began choking her again. "I was honking the horn, hoping someone would come outside," she remembered. Then, in a strange twist, Matthew returned to his own home on the property. Montana, still shaken, sought refuge with his mother and grandparents, hoping for some kind of security. As she rested, Matthew continued to text her, his words increasingly cold and threatening. "I'll take your life, her life, and his life. Mark my words," Matthew's messages read. At 3:22 a.m., he texted her, "I'm leaving. Better get here and get your kids." By the time the night had fully descended, Matthew's anger had transformed into something chillingly final. McDonough's investigation revealed that Matthew, fueled by alcohol and rage, climbed into his truck, rifle in hand, and set out in search of Livy. Just 12 minutes after sending the message to Montana, he texted again, "I'm home. I got Livy's keys and her phone." It was then that Montana, though deeply disturbed by his words, still didn't fully grasp the gravity of the situation. "I didn't think he was serious," she explained to investigators. "I didn't call 911. But Matthew was serious." And as the hours passed, McDonough and his team pieced together the devastating truth. Matthew returned to the crime scene, this time in his cousin Zach's truck, parked behind Livy's car. This act would forever question his motives and his involvement. Still, Montana's failure to call 911 left many puzzled. Her friend Bailey couldn't comprehend why she hadn't alerted authorities. After those texts, "How could you just ignore that?" Bailey asked, her voice filled with disbelief. 2 months after the murder, Montana was subjected to a polygraph test, which she failed, further complicating the investigation. But after an extensive investigation, law enforcement cleared her of any involvement in Livy's death. For McDonough, all signs pointed to Matthew Edgar, and the motive was clear: jealousy. In February 2021, the pandemic stalled the court proceedings, and Matthew was released on a surprisingly low bond of $50,000. A decision that shocked those close to the case. Months later, a fateful encounter occurred. Darcy, Livy's mother, found Matthew at a local convenience store. In a fit of rage, she lunged at him, yelling, "You killed my daughter." Though Darcy was arrested for assault, her anger was understandable. She wanted answers. As the months dragged on, the evidence continued to build. In March 2021, Matthew was finally indicted for Livy's murder. But even as the legal process moved forward, Matthew's actions didn't cease. He continued to harass Livy's family, refusing to let them heal. By January 2022, as the trial loomed, Darcy was certain that the truth would finally come out. The damning evidence was overwhelming. Matthew's text messages, his presence at the crime scene, and the discovery of Livy's phone and keys in his possession painted a grim picture. And then there was Cindy, Matthew's mother, who had suggested a bizarre theory about a drug cartel being behind the murder. It was a desperate attempt to deflect suspicion from her son, but it only deepened the tragedy. "It was just a fairy tale," McDonough said, shaking his head. "A crazy story to distract from the truth." As the trial began in January 2022, Matthew entered the courtroom each day as a free man. But for those who loved Livy, this would not be the end. It was only the beginning of a long-awaited quest for justice. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. It wasn't just the gravity of the crime that weighed on the atmosphere. It was the fear that lingered, a county on edge, knowing the accused could still be lurking in the shadows. To ensure safety, security was heightened. It wasn't just the court officers that watched the room. Matthew himself had to wear a bulletproof vest, a stark reminder of the raw emotion and volatility surrounding the trial. From the very first day, the prosecution set the tone, presenting key evidence. Evidence that was nothing short of damning. The smallest detail, a drop of blood, took center stage. How important is that piece of evidence? The prosecutor demanded. His voice rang with certainty. It's critical. It places him there at the scene when that injury caused her death. The significance was undeniable. That drop, like a silent witness, spoke volumes. But Matthew's defense attorney, Rob Hughes, quickly countered, his voice sharp, dismissive. A tiny drop of blood doesn't prove anything. He went on, trying to undermine the connection. How else could that speck have ended up on his pant leg? It could have been transferred by mere touch. There's no telling how long that blood had been there. Hughes didn't stop there. He cast doubt on other DNA evidence. Blood on Matthew's face that had been swabbed and tested, only to be ruled out as belonging to either Matthew or the victim, Livy. The blood wasn't hers. It wasn't his, Hughes argued. And once we excluded that, investigators stopped looking for other possible sources of DNA. But the defense wasn't as airtight as it seemed. The texts sent by Matthew, the ones he had no memory of, those haunted him. Hughes, with a hint of frustration, admitted, in my entire career as a defense attorney, have I ever had a client who functions during a crime? Texting, driving, and then claims they remember nothing. No. And yes, I understand how hard that is for people to believe. The weight of that statement sank into the room like a stone in water. There were other arguments too. Hughes pointed out that the murder weapon had never been tested for fingerprints or DNA, but he couldn't deny that the rifle had been Matthew's. The cracks in his defense were beginning to show. And then, in a twist that no one could have anticipated, Matthew disappeared. The day after the second round of testimony, just as Hughes prepared to present his case, Matthew became a fugitive. His mother, in a frantic call, told Hughes that her son had vanished. She feared for his life, terrified that he would take his own. Are you serious? He's gone? Hughes asked, disbelief in his voice. Matthew had managed to outsmart the system. The ankle monitor, meant to track his every move, had been tampered with. Authorities later discovered he had waited for the battery to die before fleeing on foot, leaving behind only questions and growing fear. Law enforcement immediately launched a manhunt. Local SWAT teams, Texas Rangers, and tracking dogs scoured the woods, following a trail they hoped would lead them to Matthew. Meanwhile, the trial continued in his absence. Hughes, now fighting an even harder battle, was left to face the jury without his client by his side. The jury wasn't told about Matthew's escape, but the whispers must have traveled through the courthouse. One thing was clear. Matthew Edgar had become more than a defendant. He was now a dangerous fugitive. The jury deliberated for just an hour and a half before delivering their verdict. Guilty of murder. But that victory felt hollow, a hollow echo in the face of the man still on the run. He was an armed threat, a danger to both himself and the community. As the reality set in, the people who had once known him felt a chill run down their spines. Darcy, Livy's mother, felt it most acutely. It was terrifying, she said, recalling the haunting thought that Matthew, someone who supposedly loved her daughter, had taken her life. What would he do to me? She wondered, knowing she was one of the few actively pushing for justice. But Darcy was far from alone in her pursuit. Determined to find the man who took her daughter, she began posting homemade wanted posters all over town. As she did, a quiet partnership was forming between J.P. McDonough and Special Deputy Jeff Coulter from the U.S. Marshal Service. Together, they set out to track down Matthew, knowing the fugitive was more than dangerous. He was desperate. I considered him a dangerous fugitive from the start, Coulter stated bluntly. From the crime scene, everything pointed to that. The hunt took on an urgency, but there were few leads until a tip came through. Matthew might be hiding in plain sight, just yards from his grandparents' property. The team devised a plan. Get as close as possible to the house without alerting their quarry. As night fell, Coulter's team, equipped with night vision, crept through the woods surrounding the property. Meanwhile, McDonough and his deputies waited in their vehicles, poised to act. But nature was against them. A sudden storm, heavy with lightning and thunder, descended. The roar of the storm masked their movements, giving them a slight advantage. As they closed in, the minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. This needed to end tonight, Coulter thought, the pressure mounting with every passing second. After nearly an hour in the woods, drenched and shivering, they heard voices from the back porch. And then, at 8 p.m., a figure stepped outside. "It's him," one of Coulter's men whispered. The confirmation came, and within moments the team surged forward. Screams of law enforcement, police, rang out as they closed the distance. Matthew was cornered. He turned, panic flashing across his face. "Oh crap," he muttered, as if realizing the jig was up. The confrontation was chilling. Coulter, eyes locked on Matthew's, uttered one simple word. "Matthew." He replied, his voice shaking, "You haven't proven my innocence yet." "No," Coulter responded. "I haven't." And that was when Matthew, in an unexpected moment of vulnerability, pleaded, "Please don't shoot my mother." His mother, the one who had shielded him, watched in disbelief as her son was arrested. She acted surprised, Coulter recalled. She didn't seem to know what was going on. Like she hadn't seen this coming. The arrest wasn't just about Matthew. It was about the unspoken question of who had helped him. His mother, Cindy Hogan, was later charged with hindering apprehension. And on January 3, 2023, the final chapter of Matthew Edgar's story was written. Sentenced to 99 years in prison for the murder of Livy Lewis, with the possibility of parole after 30 years, Matthew Edgar's escape had ended. But the pain of his actions would linger for a lifetime. Livy Lewis's case was not just about a tragic loss. It was about a young woman with a bright future, a family torn apart, and a community shaken by a betrayal that no one could have seen coming. Livy's life, full of promise and potential, was cut short in a senseless act of violence, but her memory would live on in the hearts of those who knew her best. In the end, justice prevailed, and the truth was revealed, bringing some measure of peace to those who had been left behind in the wake of Livy's death. The community of Hemphill would never be the same, but in their grief, they found strength. Livy's spirit, her kindness, and her dedication to others would not be forgotten. The tragedy of Livy Lewis was a reminder of how fragile life can be, and how the consequences of unchecked jealousy and violence can have ripple effects that extend far beyond one person. As the courtroom doors closed, the search for justice finally came to an end, but for Livy's family and friends, the healing process was just beginning. In the quiet embrace of a spring morning, Mansfield, Ohio, stood as a symbol of tranquility. A modest apartment complex nestled within the town hummed with the rhythm of everyday life. But on April 29, 1981, that calm was shattered. A door creaked open, revealing a truth so dark that it would haunt the community for decades to come. Inside, the remnants of a life violently interrupted lay scattered. A young woman's sanctuary turned into a scene of horror. Ordinary household items, pots, pans, even oven grates, were transformed into weapons of unspeakable brutality, painting a chilling portrait of her final moments. This is the story of how a peaceful Midwestern town lost its innocence, of a killer who vanished into the shadows, and of a community forever scarred. At the heart of this tragedy was 18-year-old Deborah Miller, a bright and ambitious high school senior, just weeks away from graduation. Her dreams, her future, her very life were stolen in one of the most brutal crimes Mansfield had ever seen. Debbie, as she was lovingly called, was born on May 14, 1962. In Cleveland, Ohio, Debbie embodied the promise of youth. She was hardworking, independent, and full of life. She had recently moved into her first apartment, a modest but cherished space that symbolized her leap into adulthood. But that sanctuary became the backdrop for a nightmare, one that investigators would describe as haunting and deeply personal. The scene was almost incomprehensible. Blood spatter told a story of prolonged violence. Everyday objects that should have been symbols of comfort were used as tools of destruction. This was no random act. It was rage personified, leaving behind questions that would torment everyone who knew Debbie. Who could have done this? And more disturbingly, why? Mansfield was unprepared for such a tragedy. In 1981, it was a city of about 50,000, where factory whistles marked the rhythm of life, and local diners were the heart of the community. It was a place where neighbors felt safe, teenagers dreamed big, and violent crime seemed like something that happened far away. But April 29th changed everything. Debbie's coworkers at Mr. T's diner first noticed something was wrong when she didn't show up for her morning shift. At first, they thought she might be running late or unwell. But as the hours ticked by and calls went unanswered, their concern grew. Debbie wasn't the type to skip work or fail to call. Her absence was out of character, and soon, worry turned into alarm. Police arrived at her apartment later that day, greeted by an eerily quiet scene. The door was locked, and repeated knocks brought no response. When they finally entered, what they found was beyond anyone's worst fears. Debbie's once cozy apartment had become a chamber of terror. Signs of a desperate struggle were everywhere. Bloodied kitchen items lay scattered on the floor, silent witnesses to the unimaginable violence that had unfolded. The medical examiner's findings only deepened the horror. Defensive wounds on Debbie's hands and arms showed she had fought valiantly for her life. She had tried to protect herself against an assailant consumed by rage, but their brutality was overwhelming. Debbie's bright future, her laughter, her dreams, all had been stolen in an act of senseless violence. The news spread through Mansfield like wildfire. Parents rushed to pick up their children. Doors that had once been left unlocked were now bolted tightly, and a once close-knit community was gripped by fear. The realization was chilling. A killer walked among them, and no one knew who it was. The murder of Deborah Miller was more than a crime. It was a turning point. The innocence of a town was shattered, replaced by suspicion and dread. And as the days turned into weeks, then months, and eventually years, the haunting question remained. Would justice ever be served? Nestled in the heart of Ohio, Mansfield had once been a place where dreams flourished. Among those dreamers was Debbie Miller, a hardworking, ambitious teenager who had her whole life ahead of her. But someone had been watching her, learning her routines, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And on that fateful April day, the unimaginable became reality, leaving behind a community that would never be the same. The brutal nature of the crime was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just a random act of violence or a botched burglary. This was personal, targeted, carried out with a level of rage that shocked even the most seasoned investigators. The scene was grotesque, an unthinkable violation. The police quickly cordoned off the area, beginning their investigation with an overwhelming sense that something deeply sinister had unfolded here. But one detail stood out above all else. Nothing had been stolen. Debbie's purse still held her wallet, her jewelry untouched. This was never about robbery. It was about something far darker, something more primal. The killer had come for Debbie, and Debbie alone. As the investigators sifted through the unsettling details of the crime, a chilling question began to haunt them. Who could have harbored such hatred for a beloved teenager? And even more unsettling, was this just the beginning? Was the killer already planning their next attack? Detective Sergeant Robert Hayes, the lead investigator assigned to the case, began piecing together the final hours of Debbie's life. As detectives combed through her apartment, they quickly realized this was no ordinary crime. The brutality of the scene suggested wild, uncontrolled rage. But there was something more. Something subtle. The killer had entered without forcing the door. They hadn't had to. It was almost as if Debbie had known the person who took her life. Through interviews with her neighbors, strange patterns began to emerge. Several residents reported hearing unusual noises from her apartment the night before. In the thin-walled building, noise was a constant, so no one thought anything of it at the time. "We heard what sounded like things falling," one neighbor would later tell the police, her voice trailing off, heavy with the unbearable weight of hindsight. "But you'd get used to the noise in these buildings. If we'd only known." The regret was palpable. Then, during a routine canvass of the building, a name surfaced. James Vainest, a 25-year-old man who lived directly above Debbie's apartment. His initial statement seemed cooperative enough. He claimed to have seen a suspicious-looking homeless man lurking around the building in the days leading up to the murder. But something about him felt off. Detectives noted how almost too helpful Vainest seemed, as if he were desperate to shift their focus elsewhere. "Most people were horrified by what happened," recalls one former investigator who worked the case. "Vainest was different. It was like he was trying too hard to point us in another direction." His alibi, too, raised suspicions. When questioned about his whereabouts during the estimated time of death, Vainest provided an alibi that, to the detectives' growing frustration, was difficult, if not impossible, to verify. Despite the substantial physical evidence, blood samples, fingerprints, and other biological material, investigators faced a crippling limitation. It was 1981. DNA testing was not yet an option. The tools they had were primitive, and they had to rely on old-fashioned detective work. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation stalled, with no fresh leads or breakthrough evidence. The initial spark of hope began to fade into an agonizing silence. As they followed up on every lead, investigators kept circling back to Vainest. But nothing concrete could be found. His tale of the homeless man seemed increasingly suspect, but no solid evidence could link him to the crime. When confronted with inconsistencies in his statements, he merely shrugged them off or offered vague explanations that couldn't be disproven. Slowly, the case grew colder. Then came the slow, almost imperceptible drift. The newspapers that had once plastered the front pages with the haunting story of Debbie's death eventually relegated the tragedy to the back sections, and then to silence. But for the detectives, something in Vainest's behavior remained like a splinter in their minds, refusing to be ignored. "Sometimes in this job, you just know," said Hayes years later. "But knowing and proving are two very different things." As the years passed, the case moved into the cold files, with Debbie's killer walking free through the streets of Mansfield. Time, it seemed, was a double-edged sword. Healing wounds, yes, but also dulling the memory of the young girl whose life had been taken so violently. The 1980s bled into the 1990s, and while Mansfield tried to move forward, Debbie Miller's murder still loomed over the town like an unhealed scar. At Malabar High School, her graduating class left an empty chair at their ceremony, a haunting reminder of the dreams that would never be realized. At Mr. T's diner, where she once worked, her photo hung on the wall, her bright smile frozen in time. And yet, James Vainest continued his life, moving away from Mansfield and eventually vanishing from the spotlight. But the case wasn't done with him. Every few years, like clockwork, new detectives would sift through the file, and each time, Vainest's name would resurface. The case was never completely closed. His shadow lingered. Retired Lieutenant Dale Fortney, who had been one of the original officers to respond to the scene in 1981, couldn't shake the weight of Debbie's murder. "Some cases just stick with you," Fortney would later say, his voice thick with the years of regret. This one needed to be solved. Throughout the years, tips would trickle in, always with the faintest glimmer of hope. Each time, investigators would follow up, only for that hope to fade again. The crime scene photos yellowed in their folders. The evidence boxes gathered dust. But the questions, the ones that had haunted everyone involved, never stopped. Who could harbor such rage toward a teenage girl? And would the truth ever come to light? By the early 2000s, Mansfield had changed. The old apartment building where Debbie had lived was renovated, her unit now occupied by tenants unaware of the tragedy that had once occurred within its walls. Mr. T's diner had been replaced by a chain restaurant. Another mark of time's passage. Yet, in the cold case files at the police department, Debbie's case remained active. Dormant, but alive. Every time we got new technology or learned about a new forensic technique, we'd pull out Debbie's file, remembers one detective. We never stopped hoping for that one break. That one piece of evidence that would crack it wide open. Then, in 2021, the impossible happened. Retired Lieutenant Fortney, now years removed from active duty, approached the department with an idea that would change everything. And just like that, the dormant case that had haunted Mansfield for decades was poised to awaken once more. In 1981, no one could have foreseen the breakthroughs in DNA technology that would one day unravel the chilling mystery surrounding Deborah Miller's murder. Back then, the case seemed impossible to solve, but as the years passed, the hope of justice slowly dwindled. Yet, in the dawning days of the 21st century, a glimmer of hope reemerged. Perhaps, just perhaps, the evidence that had been preserved so carefully, silent witnesses to a crime decades old, might finally speak its truth. Detective Terry Butler and DNA analyst Don Fryback stepped into this cold case in 2020, equipped with the very tools that could have only been dreamed of back in 1981. With a sense of purpose, they began their work. We approached it like it happened yesterday, Butler later recalled, and indeed, it was as if the clock had never stopped ticking. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every forgotten detail was brought back to life. But it was the seemingly innocent kitchen items, the everyday objects that had been turned into brutal instruments of violence, that held the most potent clues. Using cutting-edge DNA extraction techniques, Fryback painstakingly worked through the decades-old samples, each test more revealing than the last. The results were beyond startling. Male DNA profiles emerged from multiple objects in Debbie's apartment, and shockingly, all of them pointed to the same man. But the truth wasn't just in the DNA. It was in where that DNA was found. Locations and patterns that spoke of a violent struggle, a battle far more intense than the casual encounter originally described. This wasn't just evidence. This was the story of a horrific crime, one that had been concealed for far too long. The breakthrough was clear. The truth was unraveling. In November 2021, Detective Butler took a long drive to Canton, Ohio, to confront James Vainist, now 68 years old. Vainist had lived quietly, far removed from the storm he had helped create. But as Butler asked questions, cracks began to appear in Vainist's facade. Under the pressure, the carefully constructed lies started to crumble. For the first time, Vainist claimed that he and Debbie had been intimate the night before her murder. A bold contradiction to his original statements. As Butler pressed him, his answers grew more erratic, more desperate. He stammered, "I wasn't feeling well that night," trying to explain his presence in her apartment. But the DNA told a different story. It was found in places he had no right to be. On the makeshift weapons used in the attack, in locations that painted a picture of violence. Yet Vainist continued to weave a web of lies, trying to justify his presence in the apartment. "I wasn't even asked about that evidence," Butler later said, yet he was answering questions we hadn't even asked. In a moment of realization, Butler knew this was the moment they'd caught him. Vainist was trying to explain away the evidence, but in doing so, he only sealed his fate. But the investigation was far from over. Over the next 3 years, the case was meticulously built, cross-referencing DNA evidence, original crime scene photos, and the shifting lies of the suspect. Each discovery tightened the grip around Vainist, and by early 2024, the case against him was undeniable. When Detective Butler reached out for a second interview, Vainist's response was telling. He immediately hired a lawyer, cutting off all communication, a stark contrast to his previous eagerness to assist investigators. The man who had lived just above Debbie's apartment, who had watched her come and go, and who had spun tales about imaginary homeless men, was now cornered. And then, he vanished. In early 2024, Vainist sold his home, purchased a pickup truck, and disappeared without a trace. The quiet life he had built in Canton was abandoned, and the man who had eluded justice for so many years was now a fugitive on the run. But justice doesn't sleep. Law enforcement tracked him to West Virginia, where Venus made his fatal mistake. A convicted felon from a 1970s bank robbery, he had illegally acquired firearms. An offense that gave authorities the opening they needed. On August 12, 2024, Venus was arrested on federal gun charges. But the end was not yet in sight. After posting bond, he vanished once again. This time, however, investigators were prepared. Venus was no longer the man trying to maintain his appearance. He was now a desperate fugitive with nothing left to lose. The final chapter in this decades-long drama would unfold at the Roadway Inn in Canton, Ohio. On a cold November morning in 2024, U.S. Marshals and the Canton Regional SWAT team surrounded the motel where Venus had holed up. They had tracked him to a second-floor room, but there would be no surrender. Venus, cornered and desperate, was ready to fight to the death. When officers approached, he made his intentions clear. He wasn't going to prison. With chilling clarity, he pointed a gun at the officers, his hand steady, his resolve unshaken. The standoff turned into a nightmare. Venus barricaded himself inside, transforming the cheap motel room into his last battleground. "Get back! I'm not going to prison," he shouted through the door. And then came the sound no one had wanted to hear. Gunshots. Venus fired through the walls and windows, sending innocent bystanders into a panic. Officer Patrick Lewis was struck, but miraculously survived. Negotiators tried to talk Venus down, but the man who had lived with his dark secret for 43 years had made up his mind. As Venus raised his weapon one final time, SWAT officers had no choice but to open fire. The man who had watched Debbie die, who had lived free for over 4 decades, was brought down in a hail of gunfire. In the aftermath, investigators found chilling evidence in Venus' motel room. He had been planning to flee the country. Maps, cash, a new passport. But it was too late. His violent last stand had sealed his fate. The case that had haunted Mansfield for over 40 years was finally over, though not in the way anyone had hoped. In December 2024, Mansfield's police chief, Jason Bauman, stood before the press, announcing that the case was officially closed. James Venus had murdered Deborah Miller in 1981. Though his death meant he would never stand trial, the truth had been uncovered. For the Miller family, it brought the answers they had waited a lifetime for. But it could not bring their daughter back. Debbie would forever remain the vibrant teenager, her life stolen by a man who had lurked in plain sight for nearly half a century. Her case had become a symbol of the relentless pursuit of justice and the power of modern forensic science. Though the world of Mansfield had changed since 1981, one thing remained constant. The haunting truth that some secrets, no matter how deeply buried, will always come to light. And as the story of Debbie Miller's murder finally reached its bitter conclusion, the question lingered. How many other killers, watching from the shadows, believe that time has erased their sins? In the quiet suburban town of Yeadon, Pennsylvania, where the hum of daily life seemed to offer a sense of safety, the sudden disappearance of 15-year-old Deanna Wright McIntosh shattered the peace and left a community gripped by fear and uncertainty. On December 3, 2004, Deanna vanished without a trace, setting off a frantic search that would uncover a tragic and horrific story. Just weeks later, her lifeless body was discovered in a steel drum, abandoned in a desolate lot in West Philadelphia. The brutal murder of this vibrant teenager, full of dreams and potential, would not only devastate her family but send shockwaves through her entire community. This is the chilling tale of a young girl's life cut short, the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of those she trusted, and the quest for justice that followed. Deanna Wright McIntosh, known affectionately as Dee Dee, was born on June 28, 1989. Deanna lived with her mother, Darlene Wright, and her grandmother in Yedden, a small town just minutes away from Philadelphia. Her father, Jim McIntosh, a retired FBI agent, lived nearby, and despite her parents living separately, Deanna shared a close bond with both. Those who knew her recall a girl who lit up every room she entered. Deanna was outgoing, friendly, and endlessly creative. As a sophomore at Penwood High School, she balanced academics with her love for modeling, theater, and dance. Singing in the choir at Mount Olive Baptist Church, where her grandfather had once been a founder, brought her immense joy and showcased her deep-rooted faith. By all accounts, she was a typical teenager with a promising future ahead. Yet, like many teenagers, Deanna experienced the growing pains of adolescence. Balancing school, friendships, and family relationships wasn't always easy. She had her struggles, particularly with her grades, which sometimes caused tension between her and her mother. Darlene, ever the devoted parent, only wanted the best for her daughter. But Deanna, like many 15-year-olds, longed for independence and sometimes clashed with her mother over their differing perspectives. On December 2nd, after a heated argument about her slipping grades, Deanna decided to spend the night at a friend's house. It wasn't a runaway act. Darlene knew where her daughter was and trusted that she needed time to cool off. By the following day, tensions seemed to ease. Deanna met with her mother and a school counselor to address her struggles and promised to do better. For Darlene, it was a hopeful moment, a sign that brighter days were ahead. But the hope of that day would soon turn to despair. After school, Deanna and a friend decided to visit a local nail salon, an ordinary outing for two teenagers. But after leaving the salon, Deanna vanished. When she failed to return home that evening, Darlene's concern turned to panic. Deanna had promised to come home, and her failure to do so set off alarm bells. Without hesitation, Darlene reported her daughter missing, initiating a frantic search that would soon grip the entire community. Friends, family, and neighbors came together, distributing flyers, scouring the streets, and pleading for information. As the hours turned into days, the fear of foul play began to overshadow the initial hope that Deanna had simply stayed out longer than expected. The Pennsylvania State Police ramped up their efforts, enlisting helicopters to scan the area, and the FBI provided expert profilers to aid in the investigation. Despite their efforts, every lead ran cold, and no trace of Deanna could be found. Weeks passed, and the once hopeful search turned into a desperate cry for answers. The community held on to hope, but as the days dragged on, the grim reality began to sink in. Something terrible had happened to Deanna. Then, just weeks after her disappearance, that horrifying truth was confirmed. In an abandoned lot in West Philadelphia, a steel drum was discovered, and inside it lay Deanna's lifeless body. The brutality of her murder was almost incomprehensible. The vibrant, loving teenager who had dreams of modeling and a future filled with endless possibilities had been stolen from her family in the most heinous way imaginable. The discovery shook the community to its core, and the question that haunted everyone was the same: who could have committed such an unspeakable act? The sudden disappearance of 15-year-old Deanna Wright McIntosh sent shockwaves through her close-knit suburban Philadelphia community. It wasn't just those who knew her who felt the dread of her absence. It was an entire community, gripped by fear and a haunting sense of vulnerability. As days dragged on with no sign of Deanna and every lead falling into a frustrating dead end, hope began to fade. But just as the investigation seemed to stall, a crucial piece of the puzzle emerged from an unexpected source. A tip that would take the case in a chilling new direction. In mid-December, the Ridley Township Police received a phone call that offered the first real breakthrough in the case. The caller, a man from a nearby suburb, claimed that one of his acquaintances had confessed to a horrific crime. He had beaten a young girl to death, assaulted her, and then gone on to dismember her body with an axe before disposing of her remains in trash bags. The gruesome details of the account were enough to compel investigators to act. While it's unclear exactly how much information the man initially provided, the significance of his statement couldn't be ignored. He not only provided shocking details but also named 2 individuals, one of whom was Lamar Hames. This revelation was more than just disturbing gossip. It was a lead. The police acted swiftly, determined to track down these men and uncover the truth. Lamar wasn't hard to find. By the time the police linked him to the case, he was already in custody in Philadelphia on unrelated charges. With Lamar behind bars, investigators turned their attention to the second man named by the witness, Anwar Malik Geddes. The connection between Lamar and Anwar raised the possibility that the two might have acted together, and police were eager to learn what they might know. What they uncovered was more than they had anticipated. Anwar Geddes, it seemed, was not just another person of interest but also a close friend of Lamar. The two had a long-standing connection, and their relationship hinted at the possibility of shared knowledge, or worse, shared guilt. As police pieced together the details of their lives, they learned that after serving a 3-year prison sentence, Lamar had been staying with Anwar and his family. This was the first sign that the two men might have been involved in something far darker than they had initially imagined. On December 30th, 2004, nearly a month after Diana's disappearance, a tragic breakthrough came. Acting on the information provided by Anwar, police discovered the remains of a young woman in a desolate vacant lot in West Philadelphia, just off 63rd Street. The lot, abandoned and overgrown, was an eerie setting for the horrific discovery. Inside a steel drum, investigators found what was left of Diana. The body had been severely burned, making initial identification difficult, but dental records confirmed the worst. It was Diana. The news shattered her family, who had spent the past weeks desperately praying for her safe return, now faced with the unbearable reality that their daughter was gone forever. The grim discovery sent waves of shock through the community, who had watched in horror as this once vibrant young girl's life was violently stolen away. The condition of Diana's body, burned beyond recognition, made it clear that her death had been nothing short of brutal. And though they had failed to find her alive, the police now had an even more urgent task: finding the people responsible for her death. As the investigation deepened, it was clear that the case had shifted from a missing persons search to a full-blown homicide investigation. And the more investigators dug into the lives of Lamar and Anwar, the more unsettling the truth became. The key to unlocking the mystery lay in a crucial tip from the witness in Ridley Township. This man had come forward with details so shocking they would turn the case on its head. He revealed that Lamar Haines had confessed to him that he had killed a young girl, dismembered her, and then attempted to cover his tracks. The police now had names and leads: Lamar and Anwar. But it wasn't just the confession that sent chills down the investigators' spines. As they dug deeper into Lamar's life, they uncovered more disturbing facts. Lamar had known Diana, and not just in passing. He had met her the previous summer while she was working at a local pizza shop, and despite their age difference, he had become fixated on her. To those who knew him, he was infamous, known by nicknames like Fat Mar and Big Nasty, because of his imposing size. But it was his obsession with Diana, despite the 15-year age gap, that would lead to a horrifying chain of events. The final pieces began to fall into place as investigators spoke with Anwar. According to his statement, he had last seen Diana alive at Lamar's home in Lansdowne, where she had been sitting on the couch with Lamar. The evening had started innocuously enough, with the two of them ordering food. But something had shifted that night, something dark and dangerous. Anwar recalled that when he left the house around 10 p.m., Diana was still alive. However, when he returned the following day, he noticed something was terribly wrong. The house smelled strongly of bleach, and Lamar was cleaning. Far too busy to talk about the strange smell. Anwar was told not to sit on the couch because it had just been shampooed. What followed was even more chilling. Anwar later revealed that Lamar had taken him to a gas station, where he bought a gasoline can. The next day, Anwar helped Lamar load a large steel container into his car. But instead of getting back into the car, Anwar said he walked away, leaving Lamar to continue his grisly work. The next day, Lamar asked Anwar to help him transport the steel drum to a vacant lot on 63rd Street. There, Lamar set the drum on fire, hoping to destroy the evidence. It was this crucial detail that ultimately led police to the site where Deanna's body was found, and with it, the painful truth of what had happened to her. The events that unfolded over those harrowing days painted a picture of a young girl's tragic fate. Deanna had been taken in by someone she had trusted, only to be manipulated and ultimately murdered. The investigation had taken dark and twisted turns, each revelation worse than the last. But even in the face of such horror, the police remained relentless, piecing together the details, uncovering the secrets, and ultimately leading the way to justice for Deanna. In the days following Anwar Getty's confession, the investigation took a dark turn as police executed search warrants at a house on London Avenue, a location that quickly became the focal point of the case. What they uncovered inside those walls sent a shiver through the entire community. Every inch of the property was carefully combed, as investigators worked tirelessly to confirm the details from Getty's statement. The house, once a place of ordinary living, now held secrets. Secrets that would piece together the horrifying narrative of Deanna's final days. The first thing the investigators found were traces of bleach, smeared across the floors and furniture. It was clear that someone had attempted to erase the evidence of something far more sinister. An effort to cover up a crime. The couch that Getty's mentioned in his confession, an innocent piece of furniture now imbued with a dark history, was closely examined. Upon further inspection, biological evidence tied directly to Deanna was discovered, further corroborating the chilling events that had transpired within these walls. As the investigation deepened, the investigators began to piece together the timeline that led to Deanna's murder. The discoveries at London Avenue didn't just validate Anwar's words. They painted an even darker picture of the cover-up that followed Deanna's death. With each new piece of evidence, the case against Lamar Hames grew stronger, as it became increasingly clear that his involvement in the crime was undeniable. In January of 2005, Lamar Hames was charged with first-degree murder, rape, and abuse of a corpse. The case had already taken a heartbreaking turn, and it seemed as if justice was moving forward. According to reports, Lamar admitted that Deanna had stayed with him on the night of December 3rd to 4th, and that she had slept upstairs on a futon. Yet, despite his apparent cooperation, the authorities weren't swayed. They didn't buy his story, especially when it came to his involvement in the murder. It wasn't just Lamar who was facing charges now, Anwar Getty was also in the crosshairs. With Getty's confession in mind, he was charged with a long list of offenses, including tampering with evidence, obstructing justice, hindering apprehension, and conspiracy. By July of 2005, Getty was hit with even more serious charges: first-degree murder and rape. The emotional toll on the family was immeasurable, but on January 8, 2005, Deanna's funeral brought some form of closure, if only for a moment. Hundreds of mourners filled the church, paying their respects and offering support to a mother who had lost everything. The grief was palpable. Deanna wasn't just a daughter. She was a light in the lives of her family, friends, and community, and her tragic passing left a gaping hole in the hearts of all who knew her. Meanwhile, as Lamar and Anwar sat in their cells awaiting trial, their attorneys began pointing fingers at each other. Lamar's lawyer insisted that while his client may have been involved in hiding the body, it was Getty's who was responsible for the murder. Anwar Getty's, though, had his own dark history. In 1999, he had been accused of participating in the gang rape of a 17-year-old girl, though those charges were later dropped. Yet, his reputation as a predator lingered. Witnesses told police that Lamar was known for picking up young girls. Girls he would then abuse and assault. Lamar had a particular attraction to a 15-year-old girl, a fact that chilled anyone who knew him. As the wheels of justice began to turn, it was decided that both men would face separate trials. This would allow each case to stand on its own, free from the weight of the other's actions or statements. In December of 2006, nearly 2 years after Deanna's murder, Anwar Getty stood trial first. The courtroom was packed. Family, friends, and community members filled the seats, their eyes fixed on the man who had confessed to being a part of this nightmare. Prosecutors carefully laid out their case, using Getty's own words against him. The case was damning, and after just 4 days of trial, Geddes was found guilty of first-degree murder and abuse of a corpse. He was sentenced to life in prison. In the following month, Lamar Haim's trial began. By January of 2007, Lamar too was found guilty of first-degree murder, rape, and abuse of a corpse, and was sentenced to life in prison as well. But even in the face of conviction, both men sought to overturn their sentences. Geddes, in particular, filed multiple appeals, claiming ineffective legal counsel and the emergence of new evidence. He argued that his defense attorney had failed to properly represent him, and that vital pieces of evidence had been mishandled. But the courts were unmoved, consistently denying their appeals. Despite their efforts, both men remained in prison, serving the life sentences handed down to them. Deanna's death reverberated far beyond the courtroom, leaving an indelible mark on her community. The grief and anger surrounding her senseless murder lingered, a constant reminder of the dangers lurking just beneath the surface of everyday life. For her mother, Darlene, the pain was beyond comprehension. Deanna was her only child. The loss of her was a wound that could never heal. Yet, in the midst of her anguish, Darlene found purpose. She vowed to honor her daughter's memory by dedicating herself to ensuring that no other family would suffer the same tragedy. Darlene became a fierce advocate for youth safety, using her own heartbreak as a springboard for action. She launched initiatives aimed at educating young people about the dangers they might face, particularly from predators lurking in plain sight. Her message was clear: be vigilant, communicate openly, and recognize the signs of exploitation. Darlene wanted to ensure that Deanna's story was not one of mere sorrow, but one that spurred others to action. Deanna Wright McIntosh was a bright, 15-year-old girl with her entire life ahead of her. She had dreams, aspirations, and a future that was tragically stolen from her. Her death left a hole in the hearts of all who loved her, and her potential was cut short by an unspeakable act of violence. Yet, her memory lives on in the countless lives she touched and the legacy she left behind. Deanna's story serves as both a reminder and a call to action. It's a reminder of the dangers we can't always see and a call to protect the vulnerable, to never forget the faces behind the headlines. Though justice was served for those responsible for Deanna's death, it can never truly replace the life she should have had. Deanna's light may have been extinguished far too soon, but her spirit endures. She was more than just a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, a young girl with endless potential. And while we may never fully heal from her loss, we can honor her memory by working to protect the future of every young person who is at risk. In the quiet town of Grand Forks, North Dakota, the serenity of an ordinary November day in 2003 was shattered by the unthinkable. Drew Shoden, a vibrant young woman with an infectious zest for life, disappeared without a trace after leaving her shift at Victoria's Secret. What began as a routine evening spiraled into a chilling mystery that would grip the community in fear and suspense. Cryptic phone calls, shocking revelations, and an unyielding quest for justice followed in the wake of her sudden disappearance, painting a portrait of a life filled with promise, suddenly interrupted. Drew Shoden was born on September 26, 1981, in Pequot Lakes, Crow Wing County, Minnesota. Drew, affectionately known as Doodles during her childhood, was more than just a 22-year-old university student. With her radiant smile and kind heart, she was a beloved daughter, friend, and community member. While studying visual arts at the University of North Dakota, she spent her days balancing her creative pursuits with part-time work at Victoria's Secret. But Drew was more than her studies or her job. She was a whirlwind of creativity and compassion. Her artistic talents spanned sketching, painting, and photography, and her work reflected her profound appreciation for the world's beauty. Her heart, however, was even bigger than her artistic dreams. Drew devoted herself to helping others, volunteering tirelessly to bring joy to underprivileged children through activities like bowling parties and reading lessons. She also raised funds for causes close to her heart, such as the American Diabetes Association. To those who knew her, she was a beacon of hope, someone who believed in making the world a better place. But on Saturday, November 22, 2003, Drew's vibrant spirit collided with an unthinkable fate. After finishing her shift at 4 p.m., she left the store with plans for an exciting future. She dreamed of a spring trip to Australia and had been diligently saving her earnings to make it a reality. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Drew walked toward her car in the parking lot, completely unaware of the storm about to engulf her life. The first sign that something was wrong came when Drew failed to show up for her evening shift. Her absence was out of character, and her boyfriend, Chris Lang, grew increasingly concerned. He told police that she had called him shortly after leaving the mall at 5 p.m. During their brief conversation, she said the cryptic words, "Okay, I understand," before the line abruptly disconnected. At first, Chris dismissed it as a dropped call, but when hours passed with no word from Drew, worry turned into dread. At 7:42 p.m., Chris received another call from her phone. This time, all he could hear was static and the faint sound of buttons being pressed. The unease intensified, and by the time the police became involved, the situation had escalated to a full-blown search. Officers discovered Drew's car still parked at the mall. Beside it lay a knife sheath, a chilling clue that hinted at a violent abduction. As investigators worked to piece together the puzzle, Drew's phone service provider revealed a disturbing detail. Her phone had last pinged off a cell tower in Crookston, Minnesota, miles away from Grand Forks. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. Drew had likely been taken across state lines. Desperation mounted as volunteers and law enforcement scoured fields and forests, searching for any trace of her. 3 days later, a grim discovery added to the mounting tension. One of Drew's shoes was found along a bypass road near Crookston, not far from where her phone had last signaled. The find was a stark reminder that she had been in the area, and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance grew darker by the hour. Hope persisted among her family and friends, but it was fragile, flickering like a candle against a cold wind. Then came a breakthrough. A tip led police to a man named Alfonso Rodriguez Jr., who had been in Grand Forks on the day Drew disappeared. Alfonso's background sent chills through investigators. Recently released from prison after serving 23 years for multiple rapes and an attempted rape, he was classified as a Level 3 sex offender, the most dangerous designation. He lived with his mother in Crookston, just miles from where Drew's phone had last pinged. When questioned, Alfonso admitted to being at the mall on November 22nd but claimed he had only visited to see a movie. However, his story began to unravel under scrutiny. He said he watched Once Upon a Time in Mexico, but records showed the film hadn't been playing at the mall's theater that day. The contradictions painted a sinister picture, and suspicion closed in on Alfonso as the investigation took a chilling turn. The once peaceful town of Grand Forks now held its breath, waiting for answers as Drew's fate hung in the balance. Suspicion had long lingered around Alfonso Rodriguez Jr., but it was the chilling discoveries in his 2002 Mercury Sable that sent shockwaves through the investigation. When police conducted a search of the vehicle, they unearthed a concealed knife in the trunk. Ominous and foreboding. Yet it was the blood traces on the car's rear window that turned suspicion into certainty. DNA testing revealed the truth. The blood was Drew's, an undeniable link to a horrifying chain of events. Though the evidence against Rodriguez was staggering, the most haunting question loomed unanswered. Where was Drew? Even as the weight of the accusations bore down on him, Rodriguez maintained his innocence, adamantly denying any involvement in her disappearance. But the truth would soon emerge in a discovery too tragic to bear. On April 17, 2004, months after Drew's vanishing, her lifeless body was found in a drainage ditch near Crookston, Minnesota. The scene was grim and heart-wrenching. Drew's partially unclothed body lay face down in the ditch, her hands cruelly bound behind her back. For months, the frozen landscape had concealed this horrific truth, but as the snow thawed, it revealed the nightmare. Around her neck were remnants of a plastic grocery bag, a grotesque symbol of her suffering. The autopsy would later reveal signs of asphyxiation and brutal injuries, including a slash wound to her neck, though exposure to the unforgiving elements may have also played a role in her death. Adding to the gravity of the case, investigators determined that Drew had been transported across state lines, turning this tragedy into a federal crime with the potential for the death penalty. The prosecution was resolute, painting a harrowing picture of Drew's final moments. They argued that she was abducted outside the mall, violated, and ultimately murdered. Their case was bolstered by damning evidence. The knife found in Rodriguez's car, a knife sheath near Drew's abandoned vehicle, and DNA traces tying him to the crime. Hair and fibers found on Drew's body and belongings only solidified the case against him. The trial unfolded like a grim theater, with forensic experts and investigators taking the stand to reveal a chilling narrative. Dr. Michael McGee, the medical examiner, delivered a sobering testimony. He described the injuries inflicted upon Drew, including deep cuts to her neck, which he identified as the likely cause of her death. Yet, suffocation and exposure could not be ruled out. The torn pink sweater and disheveled pea coat she had been wearing spoke of a violent struggle, a fight for survival that she tragically lost. Despite the prosecution's relentless case, the defense pushed back, contending that there was insufficient evidence to prove Drew had been raped. They argued she likely died minutes after her abduction from suffocation, avoiding the critical question of whether the death penalty was warranted. Rodriguez had even offered to plead guilty to escape the ultimate punishment, but the offer was declined. The jury, however, saw no room for mercy. Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. was found guilty of kidnapping, resulting in Drew's death. In a historic decision for North Dakota, a state that had not seen a death sentence in nearly a century, the jury unanimously recommended the death penalty. Federal law allowed for this unprecedented punishment in a state where the death penalty is otherwise prohibited. For Judge Ralph Erickson, delivering the sentence was a devastating moment. In his own words, it was the worst day of his life. Rodriguez's legal team immediately sought a new trial, filing appeals and requesting stays of execution. Their efforts culminated in a dramatic turn of events in 2020 when the very judge who sentenced Rodriguez to death overturned the ruling. Erickson cited misleading testimony from Dr. McGee and the defense's failure to present critical mental health evidence that could have supported an insanity defense. The final chapter of this tragic case came in 2023. After nearly 2 decades of legal battles and emotional upheaval, prosecutors announced they would no longer seek the death penalty for Rodriguez. On May 18, 2023, Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The decision marked the end of a long and painful journey for Drew's family, who had endured years of heartache in the quest for justice. This case, with its harrowing details and profound implications, stands as a somber reminder of the darkness humanity is capable of, and the relentless pursuit of justice, even when the cost is immeasurable. In the quiet rural neighborhood of Berkeley County, South Carolina, the morning of March 3, 1989, began like any other. 5-year-old Justin Turner sat at the kitchen table, enjoying his favorite bowl of Cinnamon Crunch cereal. The routine was familiar, almost comforting. After breakfast, he would get ready for kindergarten and make his way to a neighbor's house to catch the school bus to Whitesville Elementary School. But this morning, something went terribly wrong. Justin never reached the neighbor's driveway. Somewhere along that short path, the lively, blonde-haired boy vanished without a trace. At Whitesville Elementary, Justin's absence puzzled his fellow kindergartners. As the bus pulled up to school, his friends noticed he wasn't among them. He must be sick, one child speculated, but by the afternoon, that hopeful assumption was shattered. When the bus returned to their neighborhood, Justin's stepmother, Pamela Turner, stood waiting in her usual spot. But as the last child stepped off the bus, Justin was nowhere to be seen. Panic set in. Pamela immediately alerted authorities, igniting a frantic search for the boy whose smile lit up every room he entered. Family members and law enforcement officers scoured the area for hours, calling out Justin's name as they trudged through woods, fields, and ponds. The little boy who loved playing with his friends and shared an unshakable bond with his mother was gone. Neighbors were left to wonder, had he wandered off? Or was something far more sinister at play? Justin Turner was born in 1983 in Berkeley County, South Carolina, to Victor Turner and Vivian Elaine Pace. His early years were marred by turbulence. His parents' marriage was fraught with difficulties from the start, and by the mid-1980s, the union crumbled under its weight. The divorce left Justin in his father's custody, with weekend visits from his devoted mother, Elaine. Despite the challenges, Justin remained a bright, cheerful child, navigating the storm of his parents' separation with remarkable resilience. But behind his laughter was a longing for the stability he never truly had. In the hours following Justin's disappearance, investigators turned their attention to those closest to him. Was it possible his mother, desperate to gain custody, had taken him? But Elaine had an airtight alibi. She and her husband, Russell Pace, were both at work when Justin went missing. Devastated by the implication, Elaine repeatedly pleaded with authorities. "I do not have my son. Please find my son." Elaine's father was the first to hear the news that Justin hadn't come home. He was at a relative's house when the phone call came, and the words sent chills down his spine. He immediately returned to Somerville, joining the desperate search efforts. Meanwhile, deputies James Gaithers and Philip Mason arrived at the Turner home, combing through every inch of the property. No detail was overlooked. The camper was searched, ponds were dredged, and wooded areas were painstakingly examined. But with each fruitless effort, the unthinkable became more likely. Justin hadn't simply wandered off. He had been taken. As hours turned into days, the weight of Justin's absence grew heavier. The once hopeful possibility of finding him safe began to waver. The search parties expanded, their calls echoing through the quiet countryside. Yet the blonde-haired boy with the sparkling eyes remained elusive. 2 days passed, each second carrying the haunting realization that Justin might be far from home, in the hands of someone capable of unspeakable acts. The disappearance of Justin Turner left a community shattered and a family clinging to hope. What began as an ordinary day transformed into a nightmare, as the small town grappled with the chilling reality that their beloved boy was gone. The unanswered questions loomed. Was Justin's disappearance a cruel twist of fate, or was there a shadowy figure lurking in the background, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? A massive search effort took shape. Over 100 individuals, police officers, volunteers, and search and rescue teams gathered to comb through every inch of the Turner family property. Determined yet weighed down by a growing sense of dread, they scoured the area relentlessly. By the third day of the search, that dread turned into a harrowing reality when Justin's father, Victor, stumbled upon a discovery that no parent should ever have to face. Tucked away in a storage compartment of a travel camper parked on the family's Horseshoe Road property, Victor found his son. Justin's lifeless body lay there, the innocence of his young life cruelly stolen. He had been strangled, and evidence indicated he had been violated. A horrifying act of violence against a defenseless 5-year-old. Though investigators found no prior signs of abuse in his life, the discovery painted an unbearable picture of his final moments. Clutched in one of Justin's tiny hands was a tuft of animal hair, a chilling detail that would haunt investigators and family members alike. Victor's anguished cry reverberated through the property, shattering the fragile hope that had carried the search forward. In the days prior, law enforcement had already examined the camper but found nothing. This raised an alarming question. Was Justin's body placed there after the initial search? Suspicion deepened as the revelation unfolded. The timing, the location, and the heart-wrenching details of his death left the close-knit community devastated. Grief rippled through the town, accompanied by a lingering fear. A predator was still out there. The heartbreak of Justin's death was felt most acutely by his family. A neighbor later remarked how their grandson, once carefree and happy to play in the yard, was no longer allowed to leave the house. Until someone is caught and justice is served, they said, none of us will feel safe. Fear gripped the neighborhood, and parents shielded their children from the world outside, desperate to protect them from an unseen evil. Yet, for all the devastation, the investigation was riddled with complications. Deputy Philip Mason, who had reportedly searched the camper before Victor's discovery, failed a polygraph test regarding his claims. To complicate matters further, both Justin's grandmother and a neighbor insisted they too had searched the camper earlier, finding nothing. How, then, had Justin's body appeared in a place supposedly checked multiple times? Adding to the mystery, the state of Justin's body puzzled detectives. His skin was unusually cold, despite the mild temperatures during his disappearance. This led to a chilling theory. Had his body been refrigerated before being placed in the camper? Yet even this grim possibility was eventually dismissed after forensic analysis. An autopsy revealed that Justin had food in his stomach, narrowing his time of death to between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. on the day he vanished. Investigators concluded that his killer was likely someone he knew, someone familiar enough to lure him into danger. Suspicion shifted inward, toward those closest to Justin. His parents, Pamela and Victor, became the focus of the investigation. Pamela insisted that Justin had left for school while she was in the shower, and she didn't realize anything was wrong until the school bus returned without him. Victor maintained that he was at work, welding pipes, during the critical hours. However, neither passed their polygraph tests. Their failure only intensified scrutiny, and soon, both parents stopped cooperating with investigators entirely, hiring an attorney and refusing further interviews. The media frenzy surrounding the case exploded. Headlines speculated about the family's potential involvement, fanning the flames of public suspicion. Berkeley County Sheriff's investigator, Lieutenant Sidney Wren, attempted to address the mounting rumors. "Is there any evidence from the crime scene to suggest an outsider was involved?" he was asked. His response was as unsettling as it was straightforward. "To my knowledge, no." Despite years of investigation, the answers remained elusive. Key evidence that could pinpoint Justin's killer never emerged. Forensic experts, detectives, and criminal psychologists all reached the same grim conclusion. The person who ended Justin's life was almost certainly someone close to him. But without hard proof, justice for the innocent boy remained just out of reach. The haunting truth about Justin's death slowly unraveled after Pamela Turner made a chilling admission. She confessed, in passing, to witnesses that she had a violent altercation with the 5-year-old boy, just before she claimed to have seen him alive for the last time. But that wasn't the only revelation she made. Pamela also acknowledged that she had lied to investigators about her whereabouts on the fateful day. Initially, she told the authorities that Justin had boarded the school bus, bound for another day at school. But that story was nothing more than a cruel fabrication. The truth was far darker. Justin never made it onto that bus. He was dead, his tiny body already lifeless inside that very house. With this disturbing new information, the jury was left with no choice but to recommend an arrest warrant for Pamela Turner, charging her with homicide. The moment of truth arrived, but when the police came to take Pamela into custody, there was no reaction. No tears. No remorse. Just a cold silence. But the twists didn't stop there. After her arrest, the case was handed over for review, and shockingly, the charges against Pamela were dropped. The reason? Insufficient evidence to directly link her to Justin's murder. Yet, the story didn't end there. Even with the charges dropped, whispers of the crime continued to linger. The case was presented to a grand jury in the early 1990s, but despite the mounting suspicions, no indictment was made. And so, Pamela, now going by the name Megan Turner, along with her husband, Victor Turner, vanished into the shadows. They left Berkeley County behind, moving away without so much as a word to the sheriff's office or the family who still mourned Justin's tragic death. Years passed, but the pain never faded. In January 1991, a new glimmer of hope emerged. A 6-year-old child came forward, claiming to have witnessed Justin's abduction the day he disappeared. But this new lead, though filled with promise, ultimately proved unreliable. The boy's memories were clouded by rumors, and investigators soon realized that his recollections were likely shaped by things he had heard, rather than the truth he had seen. Tragedy struck again in 2004 when Elaine Pace, Justin's biological mother, passed away after fighting for 15 long years to bring justice to her son. The grief of losing her was unbearable, but Russell Pace, Justin's father, made a solemn vow in the wake of her death. He promised her, on her deathbed, that he would continue the fight, no matter how long it took. "I promised my wife before she passed away that I would carry on the battle. She told me not to give up, to keep it in the news, and to never stop fighting for her. That was one of her last requests." And so, Russell did as he promised, keeping the fire of hope alive for the years that followed. In 2014, Justin's family began efforts to reignite interest in the case, pushing once again for justice. But it wasn't until 2020, over 3 decades later, that the case was brought back into the light. The Berkeley County Sheriff's Cold Case Team, now with new tools at their disposal, took up the investigation with renewed vigor. It was one of 9 cold cases they were now revisiting, handled by just 1 full-time investigator and 2 dedicated volunteers. But what they discovered next would send shockwaves through everyone involved. Sheriff Dwayne Lewis spoke of new leads, made possible by advancements in forensic technology. "We know for a fact that Justin was strangled to death. The marks on his neck were clear. And we recovered what we believe is the evidence of the murder." New technology had unlocked old mysteries. Forensic evidence, fibers, clothing, shoes, pointed to the undeniable fact that Justin had been carried from his home to a nearby camper, a location that suggested his killer knew the area well. Only the Turners had access to the camper, and only they had the keys. The pieces were falling into place. Before Justin's body was even discovered, Victor Turner was overheard asking a law enforcement official in a tone filled with anxiety, what would happen if someone in the family had caused harm to the victim? That question, uttered in nervous desperation, would soon be of great significance. The true breakthrough came in April of 2021, when forensic evidence linked fibers found in the Turner's home to the wounds on Justin's neck and his clothing. It was a game-changer, the missing link that had been sought for decades. Sheriff Dwayne Lewis credited the advances in forensic science for making this arrest possible, saying, "We got here because of new technology in forensic medicine. We kept pushing, kept trying, until we finally got what we needed." And then, on January 9, 2024, after over 30 years of unanswered questions, the breakthrough led to the unthinkable: the arrests of Megan Turner, formerly Pamela Turner, and Victor Turner. They were charged with the murder of Justin Lee Turner. The 2 were taken into custody in Lawrence County and transported to the Berkeley County Detention Center, where they would face justice for the crime they had long evaded. Despite the years that had passed, the Turners had never made any attempt to contact the sheriff's office about the case or to offer any new leads. Their silence had been deafening, in stark contrast to the unwavering support from Justin's biological mother's family, who had always remained engaged and active in the fight for justice. For the family of Justin Turner, this was a moment of bittersweet victory. A victory that came too late for his mother, but one that would finally, after all these years, bring some semblance of peace to a broken family. The case of Justin Turner, a boy who had been robbed of his life so tragically, was finally moving toward the closure it so desperately needed. The morning of March 5, 1989, held a chilling revelation, a moment that would forever haunt the investigation into Justin Turner's death. A key piece of evidence, an affidavit, came to light. Victor Turner had discovered Justin's lifeless body within mere seconds of entering the camper during the search efforts. This detail raised suspicions and placed an ominous shadow over the Turner family's involvement. For years, the truth had seemed elusive, but now the walls were beginning to close in. The room felt heavy with the weight of a dark secret, one that was starting to unravel with each passing day. In February of 2024, as court appearances became more frequent and the tension in the air grew palpable, Victor and Megan Turner stood before the judge. Their bond was set at $50,000 each. Megan was granted release on February 8th, and Victor followed suit the very next day. But the legal drama didn't stop there. What seemed like a glimmer of freedom was quickly overshadowed by a bold new defense theory, one that would send shockwaves through the proceedings. The Turners' defense team proposed a controversial suggestion. Could a serial killer, the notorious Richard Mark Evenitz, be the true perpetrator behind Justin's death? The implications were staggering. Prosecutors, recognizing the explosive nature of this new lead, requested additional time to thoroughly investigate. The judge, understanding the gravity of the situation, granted the delay, allowing both sides to dig deeper into this unsettling possibility. "This is pretty explosive evidence," the judge remarked. "And obviously, I think everybody needs time to explore that and digest that and investigate that." As the investigation continued, the discovery of a dog leash in the Turner household added another layer of intrigue. Prosecutors suggested that this leash may have been used in the brutal strangulation of Justin. However, the defense countered, calling into question the evidence's reliability. Experts voiced doubts, proposing that a dog collar might have also played a role. The courtroom was filled with conflicting theories, each one more sinister than the last. The tension in the room was palpable, with every revelation driving the case closer to a boiling point. As the proceedings unfolded, the judge issued a stern order. Victor and Megan Turner were prohibited from contacting Justin's biological mother's side of the family. They were also forbidden from traveling out of state, further tightening the legal grip on them as the case moved forward. "It's just hard to believe that the person who did it can live their life for 25 years, thinking they got away with it," one observer reflected. "It's mind-boggling. The weight of this truth, the years of suffering, and the unanswered questions seemed unbearable." But amid the legal turmoil, there was one constant: Justin's family, unwavering in their pursuit of justice. Represented by his cousin, Amy Parsons, the family's voice rang loud and clear. Amy, just a child of 8 when Justin was murdered, had grown into a fierce advocate for her cousin's memory. She established the Justice for Justin Lee Turner Facebook page, rallying support, and refusing to rest until answers were found. Amy's words cut through the courtroom, raw and emotional. "For 35 years, you have enjoyed your freedom. You do not deserve one day outside of those prison walls for what you did to Justin. You were supposed to take care of him, love him, and instead, you tortured, abused, and murdered him, your child. It takes a sick individual to do what you did to that baby, and I hope you never see life outside of those prison walls." Her resolve was unwavering. Even as defense tactics sought to cast doubt on the case, Amy remained steadfast. Her plea for justice was echoed by others, and despite the ongoing struggles, the family's determination never wavered. They stood strong, united in their grief, and their quest for justice. But the hardest part was the absence of Justin's mother, Elaine Pace. A mother who, for years, had fought tirelessly for justice but would never live to see the day when the truth would finally be revealed. Her death before the case came to fruition left a hole in the family's heart. The hardest part is that Justin's mother can't be here to see what she wanted all these years. She wanted justice. As the legal battle raged on, Justin's family continued to hold on to hope. Megan and Victor Turner would eventually be held accountable for the unspeakable crime they committed. The memory of Justin, the innocent child whose life was stolen far too soon, would never be forgotten. His funeral, held at Somerville Cemetery and Mausoleum, Dorchester County, South Carolina, drew over 200 mourners. As Justin was laid to rest, surrounded by his favorite belongings, it was clear that his life, though tragically cut short, would forever be cherished by those who loved him. The untimely loss of Justin Lee Turner reverberated far beyond his family, leaving an indelible mark on the community. Instead of celebrating his milestones, his family was left with memories of a vibrant, innocent child. His life frozen in time. But there was a flicker of hope amidst the darkness. The journey to justice may be long, but the pursuit of truth, driven by love, pain, and an unyielding desire for accountability, remains stronger than ever. It was a brisk November day in 1997 when an unsuspecting man ventured out on his ATV through the winding trails of Washington Valley Park in Bridgewater, New Jersey. The trails, surrounded by dense woodland, were a haven for locals seeking adventure amidst nature's quiet embrace. Fallen autumn leaves blanketed the ground, painting the forest floor with shades of amber and crimson. A picturesque setting that would soon become the backdrop for an unsettling discovery. For the rider, it was supposed to be an ordinary day of exploration. But as he navigated a secluded path off Gilbride Road, something unusual caught his attention. At first, it seemed like discarded clothing or perhaps a sleeping bag carelessly abandoned in the woods. But as he approached, his heart sank. Beneath the delicate veil of fallen leaves and a touch of morning frost lay the lifeless body of a young woman. At first glance, she appeared peaceful, almost as though she were merely sleeping amidst the forest's serenity. But the dark bruising around her neck told a far more harrowing tale. Trembling, the man reached for his cell phone, a relatively novel gadget in 1997, and dialed for help. Within moments, the quiet stillness of the woods erupted into chaos. Police cruisers arrived, their flashing lights piercing the early evening gloom, and investigators set to work, transforming the serene landscape into a hive of forensic activity. The victim was soon identified as 23-year-old Tamara Tigner. Tamara Tigner was born on July 12, 1974, in Colorado. Tammy had moved to New Jersey in search of a fresh start, hoping to escape a past marked by hardship. With her blonde hair, warm smile, and petite stature, she was remembered by those who knew her as kind-hearted and full of life, despite her struggles. Tammy had battled addiction and resorted to sex work to sustain herself, but those who encountered her spoke of a sweet soul yearning for a chance at redemption. Investigators pieced together Tammy's last known moments. She had been seen alive in Newark, about 20 miles from where her body was discovered. Staff at a local soup kitchen recalled her visit earlier that day. She had stopped by seeking food and clothing, even speaking of her hopes to turn her life around and possibly reunite with her family. Witnesses also mentioned seeing her climb into an orange van, a detail that would become a critical, yet elusive lead. The location where Tammy's body was found raised significant red flags. The secluded dirt road wasn't a place one would stumble upon. It was remote, hidden from plain view, and clearly chosen with purpose. The killer had gone to great lengths to ensure Tammy would not be found quickly. Yet fate had other plans. Under the dim glow of portable lights, medical examiners confirmed Tammy had been strangled, likely just hours after she was last seen in Newark. While the crime scene offered few clues, a crucial piece of evidence was recovered: DNA. Although the forensic technology of 1997 couldn't immediately analyze the trace samples, it was carefully preserved, destined to play a pivotal role years down the line. As Tammy's body was respectfully removed from the scene, no one could have imagined it would take over 2 decades before this fragile evidence would finally unravel the truth. News of her murder rippled through Somerset County, leaving the community shaken and investigators grappling with a case that grew colder with each passing day. The orange van became the focal point of the investigation. Detectives worked tirelessly, canvassing Newark and the surrounding areas, interviewing anyone who might have spotted the vehicle. They pored over registration records, cross-referencing every orange van in the tri-state region. Local shop owners were questioned, parking lot surveillance tapes scrutinized, and toll booth operators interrogated. But in 1997, before the widespread use of security cameras and sophisticated surveillance systems, tracking down one elusive van in the bustling streets of New Jersey was like searching for a needle in a haystack. Tammy's murder case soon joined the ranks of unsolved mysteries, her name added to a growing list of victims who had been failed by the justice system. Yet her story remained etched in the hearts of her family and investigators, a puzzle waiting for its final piece. Little did anyone know that a breakthrough would come, but it would demand patience, perseverance, and the relentless march of time. The DNA evidence, though silent for decades, held the key to unlocking the truth. And when the day finally arrived to revisit this cold case, it would not only expose a killer but also reaffirm the power of justice, even when it's delayed. Several tips poured in, each one more desperate than the last. People claimed to have seen an orange van, an elusive, burning flash of color, driving through various neighborhoods, each sighting promising a breakthrough. But each time, the trail grew colder, leading to nothing but dead ends. Meanwhile, a separate team of investigators, hungry for answers, turned their focus to Tammy's past. They desperately tried to piece together the puzzle of who might have wanted her silence forever. Tammy had come to New Jersey, carrying nothing but the weight of her troubled past and a backpack that held the remnants of a broken life. She had fled Colorado, seeking refuge, hoping for a fresh start in a place that might offer the freedom she so desperately craved. But like so many lost souls struggling with addiction, Tammy found herself drifting from one dangerous situation to another, vulnerable and exposed to the predators who lurked in the shadows, waiting for an easy target. In the weeks before her death, her movements were those of a woman desperately trying to survive, bouncing between shelters, occasionally seeking the comfort of support services. It was clear that she wasn't just trying to stay alive. She was searching for a way out of the chaos that had consumed her life. The detectives knew they had to dig deeper. They turned to the women who worked the same streets. Those who shared Tammy's world, who might have seen something that would crack the case wide open. Many were hesitant to speak, their fear of the dangers lurking in the shadows stronger than their desire to help. But a few, brave enough to speak the truth, revealed something chilling. A man in an orange van had been seen lurking around the area in the weeks before Tammy's death. Some of the women recalled him trying to pick them up, offering rides with a sly smile that masked something far darker. Back at the crime scene, forensic teams worked tirelessly. Under the harsh lights, they meticulously collected the scraps of evidence that could hold the key to unlocking the mystery. DNA samples were gathered from under Tammy's fingernails. Faint traces of a struggle that whispered of the violence she had endured. Detailed photographs were taken of the drag marks, a silent testimony to the horror that had unfolded in those final moments. Fibers, hair, and any trace of the killer's presence were carefully bagged, tagged, and catalogued, each piece an elusive clue in a complex puzzle. But in the late 1990s, forensic science was still in its infancy. The tools they had were crude compared to what would one day be possible. DNA could be collected, but analyzing it was a whole other battle. And so, the trail began to fade. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. The momentum of the investigation slowed, and Tammy's killer remained free, perhaps believing they had committed the perfect crime. But the case didn't go cold immediately. The investigators, relentless in their pursuit of justice, continued to chase down every lead, review every piece of evidence, hoping for a breakthrough. Yet, with each passing month, the trail grew colder, and the frustration within the team became almost palpable. They had a victim. They had physical evidence. They even had a distinctive vehicle to search for. And yet, somehow, the killer had slipped through their fingers. They didn't know it then, but the evidence they had gathered would eventually tell its story. If they were willing to wait long enough. It would take 26 years. 26 years of painstaking silence before the pieces would finally fall into place, driven by revolutionary advancements in forensic science. The case file, once thick with false leads and dead ends, grew even more so over the years. Now and then, someone would call the tip line, recalling a fleeting image of an orange van from that night in '97 or claiming to know something about the murder. Each time, the detectives would jump into action, chasing down the leads with fervor, only to be met with the same bitter result: nothing. Just another dead end. Another false hope dashed. Throughout the early 2000s, the investigation persisted, though the sense of urgency waned. Investigators revisited the evidence from time to time, hoping that advancements in DNA testing might reveal something they had missed. The DNA samples, once locked away, were carefully removed from storage, their potential waiting to be unlocked. As the years passed, the original investigators began to retire, and the case files were passed to a new generation of detectives. These fresh eyes examined the evidence with a renewed sense of determination. They studied witness statements, hoping to find inconsistencies or overlook details. The orange van had become almost mythical, a ghost haunting the investigation. Some detectives began to question whether the van's bright color had been a deliberate choice by the killer, knowing it would be so noticeable that witnesses might second-guess their own memories. Others speculated that the van had long since been repainted or even scrapped, erasing what might have been their best piece of evidence. The van, once a key lead, had become a point of debate in every meeting, an elusive clue that seemed to fade further into the distance with each passing year. Was it really orange? Or had time distorted the truth? Was it relevant? Or had it been nothing more than a misleading detail? By 2010, Tammy's case had become just another cold file among thousands of unsolved murders across the country. It was pulled out during periodic cold case reviews, examined briefly, and then tucked back into the archives when no new leads appeared. But the world had changed. The internet transformed the landscape of investigations, social media emerged as a new tool for sharing information, and DNA testing advanced at a rapid pace, offering new hope for cases that had long been thought unsolvable. But Tammy's case, despite all these advancements, remained stubbornly out of reach. Her photograph sat on the department's cold case wall, a silent reminder of a life cut short. Yet, behind the scenes, something was shifting. DNA technology was advancing at a pace that once seemed impossible. Methods that were once the stuff of science fiction were now becoming reality. By 2020, these advancements began to crack open cold cases that had remained sealed for decades. And for Tammy, that breakthrough was just around the corner. In January 2023, after 26 long years of silence, Tammy's case roared back to life. The Somerset County Prosecutor's Office made the decision to resubmit the DNA evidence collected in 1997 for new testing. What had been impossible to analyze in the 90s was now being processed with astonishing precision, thanks to the leap forward in forensic technology. This time, the results were different. This time, they had a match. The DNA testing revealed a high-stringency profile. A genetic fingerprint so precise it could pinpoint a single individual. When investigators ran this profile through the National DNA Database, a hit came up. The name that appeared on their screen was Robert Creeter. At first, the name meant nothing to the investigators, but as they dug deeper, the story began to emerge. Robert Creeter, now a frail 60-year-old man, had once woven himself deeply into the fabric of New Jersey's Somerset County. Although born in Canada, his early years were spent under the shadow of American life. Yet, it was his movements after Tammy's tragic death that piqued the interest of investigators. Just 5 years after the brutal killing, Creeter vanished, moving back to Canada and settling in Winnipeg. The timing was nothing short of suspicious. Why would a man, with deep roots in New Jersey, suddenly uproot his entire life and relocate to a different country? This puzzling move set off alarm bells. As detectives began to piece together the fragments of Creeter's life, they uncovered a disturbing pattern. For years, he had been living under the radar, his criminal record buried beneath layers of time and distance, largely unknown to Canadian authorities. The DNA match was just the first spark that ignited a long, arduous investigation. But building a case that would withstand the scrutiny of a courtroom would be no easy task. The team of investigators combed through Creeter's movements, trying to pinpoint his whereabouts in the late 90s, the time when Tammy was last seen alive. They scoured the Newark area for any connection to the elusive orange van. They interviewed potential witnesses who might recall something about him. Anything that could finally break the case wide open. In May 2023, after months of relentless work, Somerset County prosecutors had what they needed, the DNA evidence, now paired with their investigative findings. They were ready to act. The only problem: their prime suspect was living across an international border. The chase had begun. But this time, it wasn't just about tracking a killer within a single jurisdiction. The man they were hunting had crossed into another country, making their pursuit a tangled web of international diplomacy, bureaucracy, and precision timing. The Somerset County Prosecutor's Office joined forces with the United States Department of State and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, forming an intricate operation to bring Creeter to justice. But every step of the investigation had to be carefully coordinated. Investigators couldn't simply cross the border and make an arrest. Everything had to follow legal channels. An arduous, time-consuming process. For months, Canadian authorities tracked Creeter's movements in Winnipeg. They shadowed his every move, meticulously building a case that would meet both American and Canadian legal standards for extradition. It was a delicate balancing act. They learned that Creeter had been living in a modest apartment, working odd jobs, and keeping to himself. His life had become a dull routine, a far cry from the man who had once lurked on the streets of Newark. He had no family, no real friends, no roots. He'd spent the last 2 decades trying to remain invisible. But as they say, the truth has a way of finding the light. On June 27, 2024, the breakthrough finally came. Early that morning, Canadian authorities, armed with months of preparation, moved in. They caught Creeter completely off guard, arresting him in the parking lot of his apartment complex. He didn't resist. He didn't try to run. Instead, he seemed resigned, as though he had been waiting for this moment, knowing it would come. It had taken 26 years for justice to find its way to him, but it had finally arrived. However, Creeter's arrest was only the beginning of a long, complicated process. The extradition between Canada and the United States was no simple task. For months, the legal teams from both countries sifted through mountains of evidence, reviewing volumes of diplomatic agreements and legal briefs. The fate of one man's freedom rested in the hands of a vast network of officials. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the moment came. In November 2024, Creeter was flown back to New Jersey under heavy security, escorted by United States Marshals, ensuring there was no chance for him to slip away. December 4, 2024, marked a grim and anticlimactic moment in the case. There, in a Somerset County courtroom, stood Creeter. An elderly man, wearing a bright yellow jumpsuit, using a walker to support his frail frame. He looked nothing like the ruthless predator who had stalked the streets of Newark in 1997. His hair, once dark, had now gone gray, and his face bore the marks of time. But one thing hadn't changed: the cold, emotionless look in his eyes. As the court session unfolded before Judge Angela Borkowski, Creeter's past was dragged into the spotlight. The court learned of his criminal history. 16 previous indictable convictions that stretched back decades. He had spent a lifetime evading consequences, moving between jurisdictions whenever his past began to catch up with him. Now, standing before the judge, his options were dwindling. Given his extensive record and flight risk, having already fled to Canada once, the judge ordered that Creeter be held without bail until his trial. When the judge asked if he consented to detention, Creeter's response was barely audible. Just a quiet yes. As he was led away in handcuffs, Tammy's family sat in the gallery, their eyes fixed on the man who had stolen their daughter's future. For them, this was not the end of their journey, but another chapter in their long wait for justice. Tammy's mother had spent 26 long years making annual phone calls to the prosecutor's office, never giving up hope. Now, at long last, she had a name. A face to attach to her daughter's death. It wasn't closure, not fully. But it was something. It was hope. Now, Creeter faces first-degree murder charges, and his trial is set to begin in 2025. If convicted, he could spend the rest of his life behind bars. But this case represents something far bigger than one man's punishment. It is a testament to the power of persistence, of how evolving technology can breathe new life into cold cases. DNA, once a limited tool, has now become the key to unlocking the past, revealing the truth even after decades of silence. And somewhere, in evidence lockers across the country, there are countless other DNA samples waiting to tell their stories. How many other killers are living free, thinking they've escaped justice? How many families are still waiting for that phone call, the one that finally brings the answer they've been searching for? As Tammy's case proves, it's never too late for justice to catch up with a killer. As the courtroom doors close on Robert Creeter's case, it marks not just the culmination of a decades-long pursuit of justice, but the beginning of healing for a family that had waited so long for answers. Tammy's murder had haunted her loved ones for 26 years, leaving them in a state of unrelenting grief and uncertainty. Yet, through the persistence of investigators, the evolution of forensic technology, and the unwavering dedication of her family, justice finally found its way to the man responsible for her death. Creter's arrest, extradition, and eventual trial serve as a reminder of the resilience of truth, no matter how buried beneath time, distance, or deception. For Tammy's family, it wasn't just the legal victory that mattered most. It was the restoration of her memory, the acknowledgement of her life, and the chance to confront the man who had stolen her future. As the trial approaches in 2025, the wheels of justice will continue to turn. Tammy's story will echo far beyond the walls of the courtroom, reminding us that no crime, no matter how old, is ever forgotten. And for those still searching for justice in cold cases, Tammy's story serves as a beacon of hope. It's never too late for truth to be revealed, for justice to prevail, and for families to finally find the peace they've been denied for so long.